Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon. Let me begin by sharing a puzzle with you. In September of 2000, there was a nationwide Gallup poll on the issue of medical privacy. The results of that poll showed that 92% of those polled opposed government agencies having access to people's medical records without the patient's consent. Yet, within months of the time that that poll was taken, the Clinton administration and the Bush administration put into place regulations that allowed government agencies exactly such access to our medical records. The reality is, today, government seems to grow even when the public doesn't want it to grow, and seldom shrinks even when the public would prefer it to shrink. Whether Republicans or Democrats are in office, it seems that outcomes are largely the same. Indeed, many government programs seem to have achieved a near immortality, as Ronald Reagan once remarked. The puzzle is, how do these kinds of things happen under our form of government? My book provides a new explanation of the strategies and the tactics that enable government to grow even when the public doesn't want it to, and thereby make us increasingly dependent on DC. As to our records, that result was accomplished by calling the regulations privacy regulations. Once they called them privacy regulations, everybody relaxed and figured they didn't need to read the fine print. It turns out, as many of you probably know, that type of a strategy is not unusual. I've spent the past 15 years or so studying the origin and evolution of various key federal programs, including Social Security, income tax withholding, federal education laws, federal health care legislation, and database mandates that have been issued by the federal government. In each case, regardless of the party in power, government officials succeeded in expanding the role and scope of government by using strategies that make it more difficult for people to resist government expansion. Let me take a moment to describe to you how I got into this kind of research, really what triggered this project that wound up with the book. While I was still back in graduate school in economics, a professor of mine who's very well known in his field presented to our class a strand of the economic literature that has come to be known as the what is efficient approach. The idea of that is that, according to those who believe it, that what we see in the political realm, for example, all the redistribution that we see in government, must be efficient, because if it were not efficient, then people would rise up to change it. So no matter how big the subsidies are to dairy farmers or to sugar growers, they must be efficient. Well, although my professor presented that idea to our class as unquestioned truth, I thought that the analysis ran counter both to logic and common sense. And I resolved that I would develop a theoretical explanation of why the what is efficient approach is incorrect. I began to think about the many theories that we have about the growth of government, many fine theories. There are theories about rent-seeking that are associated with a public choice school. There are theories about credit claiming and blame avoidance. There are fine theories about crisis-induced growth of government, and many, many others in addition. But as I reviewed the literature, I found that none of these approaches refuted or was capable of refuting the assertion that what is efficient in the political realm. The result of my thinking and research in this area was a doctoral dissertation in which I developed the theory that I now call the theory of political transaction cost manipulation. What that theory does is to show how inefficient outcomes can arise in political contexts, and thus it refutes the what is efficient approach. The core idea of this theory of political transaction cost manipulation is that government officials have both the incentives and the opportunities to increase people's costs of taking political action on measures that affect the role and scope of government. These political transaction costs are costs that we experience in taking collective political action. Formally, they're thought of as agreement and enforcement costs. What does it cost us as human beings to get together and make collective decisions about the role and scope of government? So what it comes down to is the cost to each of us of perceiving and taking actions based on those perceptions of the costs and benefits of government authority in particular areas. So my theory focuses on contrived political transaction costs, those transaction costs that are deliberately created by government officials for their own purposes. A major implication of the theory is that to the extent that government officials actually practice political transaction cost manipulation, they're able to change the cost to us of taking political action, and consequently, if they, for example, increase the cost to us of resisting a government expanding move, they're going to get less resistance, and so government is going to be able to grow to a larger scale than otherwise would be possible or tolerated by the public. In developing this theory, I wanted to do a couple of things. One was to show how this was a unifying theory that drew together various other strands of the literature, various other observations about how government officials behave. So I set out to describe the types of behavior that fall under this political transaction cost manipulation heading. I developed a taxonomy that lists these out. You'll find that in the book. But there are two major categories of political transaction cost manipulation. One is information costs. And in the information cost category, there are things like semantic efforts to change people's perceptions of the costs and benefits of government action in a particular area. So, for example, just a few months ago, Congress passed and the President signed into law a new huge farm subsidy bill. But of course, it was not called the new huge farm subsidy bill of 2002. Instead, they came up with the name Farm Security and Rural Investment Act of 2002. So, political transaction cost manipulation. Also in the information cost category, and I have lots of examples in the book, distortion of information, restriction of access to information about the costs and benefits of government policies and actions in various areas. Another big one is incrementalism. And time and again, you see government officials presenting us not with the whole policy measure that they're after, but with a slice at a time. Healthcare legislation comes to mind. And what that does, it changes our information costs by causing us to look at one little slice and to consider the costs and benefits of the one little slice rather than looking at the whole package. I list out other examples in the book, but a couple of them would be the deliberate choice of tax measures and forms of taxation or forms of subsidy so as to change people's perceptions of the costs or benefits involved. The other category besides information costs, the other category of political transaction cost manipulation is what I think of as the action cost side. So the actual getting together of all of us as citizens to get something done in the political realm. And again, I list out lots of them in the book. One important one, it pertains to the formal amendment process that we have in the Constitution. As you all know, the founders set forth in Article 5 of the Constitution a process for formally amending the Constitution. And the idea was, yes, we could change it, but it was supposed to be very costly to do so. So it wouldn't be lightly done. If we wanted to expand the role and scope of government, we had to do it carefully and thoughtfully, and it would be properly costly to do it. Well, what we've done, as you know, in recent decades is to, in effect, allow the U.S. Supreme Court to change the meaning of our Constitution without benefit of any formal amendment process. And what that does, from my perspective, is it turns the transaction costs of taking action to expand the role and scope of government completely upside down. Instead of having the people who want to expand the scope of government bear large transaction costs, now, if you wanted to stop it, you'd have to pass the constitutional amendment to keep it the way that it used to be. So to me, that's a very important example, given the number of constitutional reinterpretations that we've seen, not just recently, but dating from the 1940s, when the U.S. Supreme Court started to reinterpret the Interstate Commerce Clause so as to allow the federal government to reach even the most local of economic activities. Other things that fall under this type of political transaction cost manipulation would be, for example, directly changing the costs to private individuals of bringing judicial or administrative challenge to the government's interpretation or exercise of its existing powers. There are many procedural strategies that fall under this heading, and one very important one that you see again and again in our legal experience in this country is tying two or more bills together. So if you think about it, if you take a piece of legislation that the public really does not want, and you tie it together with 2 or 3 or 4 or 100 other measures that people do want, and you put it all together in one package and say it's got to be an up or down vote on the whole package, then it makes it much more costly for legislators as well as for citizens to resist that part of it that they don't want. So there are many more examples in the book, but I hope I've given enough to give you the flavor of this idea of political transaction cost manipulation. The other thing I wanted to do on the theory side to give the model some predictive power is to look at things from the perspective of an individual government decision maker, be it a legislator or an executive branch official, and to ask what variables, what kinds of things make it more attractive to that single government official to support a transaction cost increasing measure? What types of things would encourage that behavior? So I began to look at things like, is there an appealing rationale for the measure? So, you know, things like, is this supposed to benefit old people? Is it supposed to benefit young people? Is it for some other seemingly appealing purpose? Well, that makes it easier to support a transaction cost increasing measure. If it's a complex measure, again, that supports and encourages an individual to support a transaction cost increasing measure, either because the person can't figure out the part that's transaction cost increasing, or even if he does understand it and support it, after the fact, he can say that he didn't understand it. It was just too complex. He didn't know it was in there. Other variables would include executive support for the measure, that is presidential support for a transaction cost increasing measure, the support of one's political party for the measure, the idea that there is some political job security or perquisites of office associated with a measure. Those are some of the variables that I looked at. So once I had spelled out the theoretical model, my next job was to go look for empirical evidence. And it sent me on what I now think of as a treasure hunt for about the last 8 years, looking for the empirical evidence on the origin and evolution of various key federal programs to see if my theory seemed to be consistent with what had happened in reality. So in each one of the policy areas that I mentioned a few moments ago, Social Security, income tax withholding, and the rest, I went through thousands of pages of congressional documents, federal documents of various kinds, including committee hearings, the congressional records, and other types of federal documents. And what I found was, in each case, the story was the same. Political transaction cost manipulation was absolutely critical in the creation and passage of the program. And it was also critical and remains critical in the implementation of those programs. So let's just look at a few examples. One would be Social Security. You all know that the Social Security law was passed in 1935. And there's a common myth that this law was passed in 1935 because the public wanted it. The idea is people think that they wanted the legislation because of the ravages of the Great Depression, that they thought this would be a good idea. The truth is, the historical record shows that people did not want Social Security at that time in 1935. What they were clamoring for was needs-based old age assistance for the elderly poor. So Franklin Roosevelt had a problem because what he wanted was Social Security for all. The compulsory insurance system that in fact we have today. So what he did to get this measure through against the public opposition that existed was he packaged it together with a number of other measures that people really did want, namely old age assistance, some maternal and infant health benefits, unemployment assistance, and so on. And it was by tying these together in one package and vowing that he would not sign any part of the bill if separated from the rest that our Social Security law got passed. Well, at the implementation stage, the same types of things occurred. I could spend an hour talking about it, but I promise I won't. One of the key forms of political transaction cost manipulation in the implementation is, I think you all know, because we're told repeatedly by the Social Security Administration, that our Social Security tax burden is split between employers and employees. That I, as an employee, pay one half of it, and my employer pays the other half. Well, the truth of the matter is that we, as employees, bear almost the entire burden of the payroll tax, all 12.4% of it. That is both halves, including the employer's half, in the form of reduced wages. The explanation is in terms of elasticities of supply and demand, which we can talk about later if you would like to do that. But the truth is, economists and key public officials have known about this literally for decades, and yet government officials continue to tell us that the burden is split. I have a wonderful quotation in the book where Milton Friedman confronts a high-level Social Security executive, and the executive admits that he understands that the employee bears the whole burden, both halves, and Dr. Friedman stopped him and said, wait a minute, I regard this as an historic moment because, and the quotation went on, he wound up saying that that admission made so many of the other statements by the Social Security Administration about the relation of benefits to costs incurred, Friedman's phrase, pure hogwash. So nonetheless, as you know, they continue to tell us that. Why did they tell us that? Because clearly we're going to have less opposition to a 6.2% tax than a 12.4% tax. Similar things happened with income tax withholding. At the outset of the program, this was right during World War II, and the federal government was in the process of converting the federal income tax from a class tax on the very rich to a mass tax on a lot broader base of people. But they were afraid people wouldn't pay. So they got the idea of putting into place an income tax withholding measure, because that way the employer takes it out ahead of time. There's no issue, right, about payment. So what they did is they promoted this bill, which incidentally had been tried before in the around 1915. People absolutely hated it, and it had been repealed. But this time they put it through by telling people that it was really for the benefit and convenience of the taxpayer, that it would result in lower tax burdens if it was passed. Well, on that basis, they got the income tax withholding measure put through. In the implementation, again, we have political transaction cost manipulation, because as I think all of us well understand, we as human beings are a lot more sensitive to amounts of money that we have received. It's been put in our bank account, and we actually write a check to the government for those sums, than we are to monies that are just taken out of our paycheck before we even receive it. So the very nature of income tax withholding is a transaction cost manipulating measure. I mean, today, most people don't even know what their total tax, federal income tax burden is, and many of them have come to associate April the 15th with tax refunds rather than tax payments. Similar things happened with the passage of federal education laws. The first big one was called the National Defense Education Act of 1958. That was passed on the coattails of the Sputnik scare. Remember, in 1957, the Soviets had launched their man-made satellites that were orbiting the Earth, and there was a big scare, partly hyped up, about how this was a threat to our national defense. So people who wanted federal aid to education then jumped on that, and they actually talked in committee hearings about how it was a gimmick, about how it was an appealing rationale, a saleable rationale. It was something we could say. And yet they went out to the public and said, big national emergency, we've got to have this, and it's going to channel money to science and math and those sorts of things that would help national defense. The truth of the matter was that it would go to everybody, even, as one congressman colorfully stated, even to people who were studying flower arranging. The next big law in the education area was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. That one was said to be part of President Johnson's war on poverty. And that was the whole pitch. That was the way it got through. But the truth was that legislators had written into that law a funding formula that guaranteed that virtually every school district would get funding from this. And in fact, a disproportionate share went to wealthy school districts, not to poor ones. Again, political transaction cost manipulation. Finally, in Medicare, transaction cost manipulation went on at various levels, but some of the key ones were using an incremental approach, tying, and also misrepresenting. As far as incrementalism goes, for decades before Medicare was put into effect in 1965, advocates of this type of a program had been seeking compulsory national health insurance for everyone, but they kept getting rejected again and again. So finally, they decided, well, why don't we just cut it back and have the benefits just go to the elderly? That's a really appealing subset of the population. So that's what they did, and that incremental approach was instrumental in getting the policy passed. The other thing they did was tying, and tying occurred on many levels. I'll just tell you one. This example is that they tied the Medicare bill in with the Social Security amendments of 1965. Well, those amendments contained a lot of provisions, but one of the key ones was it contained a 7% increase in cash benefits for Social Security recipients, retirees who were getting benefits. So what that meant was, in order to vote against Medicare, a legislator would have had to vote against a 7% increase in cash benefits for Social Security recipients. And of course, that made such a vote politically almost impossible. In terms of misrepresentation, one example was the key rationale for putting Medicare into place was that legislators told us again and again the measure was intended to prevent old people from experiencing financial ruin as a result of some catastrophic illness. There were colorful things about, well, we wouldn't want to strip grandma of her last dress and what little resources she has, and so we should put Medicare into effect to prevent this. The problem was, as the legislators who were saying this well understood, there was no provision in the Medicare bill that they were pushing for coverage of catastrophic illness. In fact, Medicare Part A, the hospital insurance, simply ended for a person after 60 days. So there are many more examples in the book, but I think that's enough to give you the idea. Let me just spend a couple of moments talking about why I think this approach is useful and why the book is important. First of all, I think it provides a broad explanation of how laws get passed and programs implemented that the public simply doesn't want, and why those programs remain. In other words, how political actors grow the government and thereby increase our dependency on government. This approach gives some predictive value to our ability to understand the growth of government. It spells out the how and why and the circumstances in which this political transaction cost manipulation is most likely to occur. Furthermore, I think it closes the circle in a certain sense by linking up this political transaction cost manipulation with institutional changes that represent and implement a greater scope of government, and hence greater dependency on government. And the final step is induced ideological change. The book talks about how over time, there are ideological learning mechanisms where we as human beings get used to the environment that we live in. So people who were born in, let's say, 1975 and are in their late 20s today, they really have never known a government of the size and scope that existed for people who grew up in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. So I think one of the most important things the book does is to describe how, in this way, existing government authority tends to become self-perpetuating, both because of the contrived political transaction costs that we've embedded in our institutional structures, and also because of the induced ideological changes that I just mentioned. In sum, in my view, it is the tactics of political transaction cost manipulation that, in the span of just 70 years, have made possible the creation of a society in which each of us is heavily dependent on DC. Thank you.